All right, welcome back. So this time we're going to go over the smooth muscle in a little more depth than we ever have before. We talked about smooth muscle, and I told you that it is right in the name. It's smooth because it doesn't have striations. Um, and we find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs like the bladder, the uterus, the stomach, the intestines, in the walls of your arteries and veins, of your circulatory system, and in the respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. You'll also find smooth muscle in the eyes, where it can change the size of the iris and alter the shape of the lens. You also find it in the skin, where it is the cause of basically getting goosebumps or having your hair stand up in response to cold temperature or being scared. Um, and so let's get into it. Smooth muscle fibers are actually spindle shaped, and that's kind of like football shaped, where it's tapered at the ends and sort of like round in the middle. They have a single nucleus, and they're really, really small. They're thousands of times shorter than a skeletal muscle fiber. They actually produce their own connective tissue, which we call the endomysium, and they don't have striations and sarcomeres. But they do still have actin and myosin, the contractile proteins, and they have the thick and the thin filaments. Um, those thin filaments are anchored by what we call dense bodies, which are basically analogous to the Z discs. Um, they're fastened to the sarcolemma. So let's keep going. Uh, Smooth muscle does not contain troponin, so cross bridge formation is actually not regulated by that troponin tropomyosin complex, but it's instead by this regulatory protein called calmodulin. And basically, all you need to know is that when calcium ions bind calmodulin, it activates an enzyme called myosin kinase, which basically activates the myosin heads by phosphorylating them. Basically means use ATP to break that high energy bond. And then that allows for the heads to attach the actin binding sites and pull on the thin filaments. And basically that's how the muscle contraction works. So it's a little bit different because in previously what we've talked about, what happens is that this troponin tropomyosin complex, when it binds with calcium, that's what causes the muscle fibers to contract. But this is a little bit different. So anyway, that's all I want to go into on that. Um, Smooth muscles have to function for long periods of time without rest. If you think about the types of things that you find them in, that makes sense. In order to do that, their power output has to be relatively low. Um, so their contractions are able to continue without using large amounts of energy. Um, and interestingly, some smooth muscle can also maintain contractions even as calcium ions are removed. And so basically, that's kind of counterintuitive because usually that's what the calcium ions are what signals for muscle cells to contract. Um, Basically, what happens is we get these things called latch bridges, which allow the thick and the thin filaments that are linked together to remain linked together for this prolonged period of time without the need for ATP, without the need for more energy. So that's pretty interesting. And it allows for the maintaining of muscle tone, which remember is just the force of the muscle being never just totally flaccid, which would be bad. Um, like I said, smooth muscle is not under voluntary control. We call it an involuntary muscle. You don't think about the muscles in your urinary tract, right? That just happens due to local factors. But other things that can control smooth muscle contraction are hormones, being stimulated by the autonomic nervous system, and like I said, local factors. And that is stretching can also trigger, and that's what happens in the urinary tract. We'll talk about that in just a second. Um, Another interesting fact about this is that the axons of neurons don't form those highly organized neuromotor junctions that we talked about in cardiac and skeletal muscle, but instead, what we get are these. neurotransmitter-filled bulges right here called varicosities, and it basically happens as an axon courses through the smooth muscle, and it sort of forms those motor units that we talked about, just in a little bit of a different way. The varicosity will release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft in the exact same way that we talked about with the NMJs, but just a slightly different than what we're used to. So they have these cells called pace setter cells in all of the organs except for the heart, because the heart is a little bit different because it has cardiac muscle. But a pace setter cell spontaneously triggers action potentials and allows for contractions of the entire muscle. Smooth muscle can be organized in one of two ways, and it's right in the name. As a single unit muscle cell, which is the most common, and as a multi-unit smooth muscle. The two types have different locations and different characteristics, but let's get right into it. A single unit muscle has its muscle fibers formed by gap junctions, and that makes sense, right? If you have those gap junctions, you can basically control contractions throughout multi-cells, many cells at once, right? And so that makes sense why you would call it a single unit. You'll find those in the walls of all the visceral organs except the heart, because the heart has, again, the cardiac muscle in its walls. And when you find this, these smooth single unit muscle cells in these visceral organs, they often call it visceral muscle. Because the muscle fibers are not constrained by the organization and stretchability limits of sarcomeres, visceral smooth muscle has what is called a stress relaxation response. And you'll find that in the urinary or bladder or the stomach, which basically what happens is as it fills and expands, it will be triggered in order to do its work. So basically what happens is that it'll produce these slow, steady contractions that will allow substances like food in your digestive tract to move through the body as it expands. And so that's called a stress relaxation response. And then when we talk about the multi-unit smooth muscle cells, they won't possess gap junctions, which makes sense because if they're multi-units, they're not going to be able to be electrically coupled, basically send signals from one cell to the next. So there are basically many different units. And basically what that means is contraction won't spread from one cell to the next, but it's going to be confined to the cell that is going to be stimulated. The way that you stimulate multi-unit smooth muscles is going to be with your autonomic nerves or hormones, but not from stretching. You'll find that type of tissue in the large blood cells and the respiratory airways and also in the eyes. The last thing I want to talk about is hyperplasia, and it's similar that you'll find in skeletal and cardiac muscle cells. It's hypertrophy, which is the increase in size, but unlike other muscle, smooth muscle can also divide and produce more cells. So instead of just the cells getting larger, you can actually make more cells in this type of muscle, and that's called hyperplasia. That is going to be most evidently observed in the uterus at puberty, which responds to increased estrogen levels, which is the female sex hormone, and it'll produce more uterine smooth muscle fibers, which will greatly increase the size of the myometrium. All right, and so with that one, I'm going to call it. Make sure to read this chapter for yourself, and I'll be back with another video on section 10.9.